Stepmother called. "I'm taking my share of your dad's inheritance. You were never his favorite anyway." My stepmother called me and said, "We're taking our share of your father's estate. Get out of the house!" But what she didn't know? My father had already planned for this exact moment. He saw through her lies, and now I was about to watch her entire scheme crumble before her eyes. What did my father do to protect me? And how did Vanessa go from living in luxury to facing her worst nightmare? Stay with me. This story is about to take a turn you won't believe. My name is Deborah Carter, and 3 weeks ago, my world changed forever. My father, Samuel Carter, passed away after a brutal battle with pancreatic cancer. Losing him felt like losing a piece of myself, like someone had ripped my heart out and left a gaping hole where it used to be. He wasn't just my father, he was my mentor, my biggest supporter, the man who had taught me everything I knew about life and business. And now, just when I thought I might have a chance to grieve, I was being forced into a battle. I never wanted to fight. It started with a phone call, the kind that makes your stomach drop before you even hear the words. I was sitting in my apartment in Denver, staring at a framed photo of my father and me, taken outside the first real estate office he ever owned. I picked up the phone and immediately regretted it. Vanessa, my father's second wife. Her voice slithered through the speaker, dripping with entitlement. "We're taking our rightful share of your father's estate, Deborah. Get out of the house." I didn't even flinch. I had been expecting this. "Talk to my lawyer," I said, keeping my voice even, and I hung up. I knew this was coming. Vanessa had been circling like a vulture since before my father had even passed, waiting for her moment to swoop in and claim everything. She had married him 5 years ago, when he was still healthy and thriving, running his real estate empire like a man half his age. I had been skeptical of her from the start. She was 15 years younger than him, a former event planner with no real career to speak of, but a wardrobe full of designer labels and a taste for the finer things in life. She had a way of making herself seem harmless, charming even, but I had seen through her from the beginning. My father had too, eventually. The problem was, by the time he realized what she truly was, it was already too late. She had spent years trying to wedge herself between us, always subtly hinting that my father was too tired for our weekly dinners, that he needed to rest instead of answering my calls, that I was being selfish for demanding his attention when he had a new wife to take care of now. But I never backed down. My father and I had built something together. He had taught me everything about the real estate business, let me shadow him when I was just a kid, encouraged me to get my license and make a name for myself in the industry. We weren't just father and daughter, we were partners. And Vanessa, she hated that. She had been biding her time, waiting for the day she could push me out for good. But what she didn't know was that my father had been preparing for her. A few months before he passed, he had pulled me into his office, the one place Vanessa rarely dared to go. He looked tired, but his eyes were sharp, filled with the same fire that had built his empire from the ground up. "Deborah," he had said, his voice steady despite the weight of what he was about to say, "I know who she is. I know what she's after, and I won't let her take what belongs to you." He had spent those final months making sure his estate was ironclad. The house, the one I grew up in, the one filled with every memory I had of my mother and father, had already been transferred into my name. His business was locked in a trust untouchable by anyone but me, and his will, bulletproof. He had even recorded videos explaining his decisions, anticipating that Vanessa would try to contest it. I sat back on my couch, staring at my phone, almost amused by Vanessa's premature victory call. She really thought she could scare me into handing over what was rightfully mine. But she had no idea what was coming. I grabbed my laptop and opened the estate documents. My father's lawyer, Richard, had sent me. Every detail had been accounted for. My father had thought of everything. I could almost hear his voice now, calm and confident, reminding me that planning ahead was the key to success. He had known exactly what Vanessa would try to do. and now all I had to do was sit back and let her dig her own grave. Still, it didn't mean this wasn't going to get ugly. I poured myself a glass of wine, taking a slow sip as I thought about everything that had led up to this moment. My father had always been a brilliant strategist, but even he hadn't seen Vanessa's true colors at first. She had played the perfect role, a devoted wife, always by his side, always making sure he was taken care of. But it wasn't long before I started noticing the cracks. She redecorated the entire house within months of marrying him, erasing every trace of my mother. She pushed him to buy her expensive jewelry, designer handbags, cars that cost more than some of the properties he owned. And then, as his health declined, she became even more controlling. She monitored his calls, intercepted his messages, made it nearly impossible for me to see him alone. I remember showing up at the house one evening, only to have her block the door, smiling sweetly as she told me, "He's resting, Deborah. It's been a long day. I'm sure he'll call you when he's up to it." It took everything in me not to shove past her, but my father wasn't stupid. He saw what she was doing, and when he caught her snooping through his financial documents late one night, that was the moment everything changed. I married her because I was lonely. He had admitted to me one afternoon during one of his chemotherapy sessions. But I won't let my mistake cost you everything. That was when we started preparing. That was when he started making sure Vanessa wouldn't get a single cent more than what he intended for her. And now, it was time to see the plan unfold. I closed my laptop, exhaling slowly. Tomorrow, Richard would be contacting Vanessa and her lawyer with the news that she wouldn't be getting what she thought she would. And I was ready. I woke up the next morning to an email from Richard, my father's attorney. The subject line read, "Vanessa's response." I took a deep breath before opening it, already knowing what I was about to read wouldn't be pleasant. And I was right. Vanessa had wasted no time. She had contacted her lawyer immediately after my abrupt response to her phone call and was now contesting the will. According to her, my father had not been of sound mind when he made the changes to his estate. She was claiming that, in his final months, he had been heavily medicated, easily manipulated, and not thinking clearly. In her version of events, I had pressured him into changing everything, cutting her out, and taking what rightfully belonged to her. The sheer audacity of it made my blood boil. I clenched my fists as I kept reading. Her lawyer had filed for an emergency hearing, arguing that she needed immediate access to my father's accounts to cover household expenses. It was laughable. The house was already in my name. The accounts had been locked, and every single bill had been transferred to me weeks ago. The only thing Vanessa was desperate for was a way to keep funding her extravagant lifestyle. Richard's email ended with one simple line, "Call me when you're ready. We need to prepare." I grabbed my phone and dialed his number, my heart pounding as he picked up after the first ring. "She's moving fast," I said, skipping the pleasantries. "She's panicking," Richard corrected. "And that's a good thing." I exhaled sharply, pinching the bridge of my nose. "What's the next step?" "We let her dig her own grave," he said without hesitation. "We have everything on our side, witnesses, video evidence, medical records, but we need to be careful. If she's this desperate, she might try to pull something reckless." I knew exactly what he meant. Vanessa was dangerous when she felt cornered. She had spent the past 5 years perfecting the art of manipulation, twisting reality to fit whatever story benefited her the most. And now, she was about to go into overdrive. Richard continued, his voice steady. "The hearing is scheduled for tomorrow morning. It's sooner than we expected, but honestly, that works in our favor. Vanessa and her lawyer won't have time to fabricate anything solid." I nodded to myself, a small flicker of satisfaction cutting through my frustration. "She's going to walk into that courtroom thinking she can outmaneuver us," Richard chuckled. "And she's going to walk out realizing she never stood a chance." I hung up and set my phone down, staring out the window of my apartment. The Denver skyline stretched before me, a view I had always loved, but right now, my mind was miles away, back in the house I had grown up in, the house Vanessa had tried to claim as hers. Memories flooded in, uninvited and bittersweet. My father and I sitting on the back porch talking about business strategies as the sun set. The way he used to tell me, Deborah, always be 3 steps ahead of the competition. He had followed his own advice to the very end. He had prepared for this exact moment, ensuring that I wouldn't have to fight alone. But knowing that didn't make it any easier. I wasn't just dealing with a legal battle. I was dealing with a woman who had spent years trying to erase me from my own father's life. And now, she was trying to erase me from his legacy too. The rest of the day passed in a blur of legal documents, phone calls, and preparations. By the time night fell, I was emotionally drained, but no less determined. I sat on my couch, a glass of wine in my hand, staring at the last birthday card my father had ever given me. His handwriting was slightly shakier than usual, but the message was clear. Sometimes, the best revenge is letting people destroy themselves. I ran my fingers over the ink, my chest tightening. He had known. He had seen this coming. And tomorrow, Vanessa would finally see just how much she had underestimated him. I barely slept that night. My mind replayed every interaction I had ever had with Vanessa, every condescending remark, every passive-aggressive comment disguised as concern. The way she had slowly but methodically tried to push me out, making me feel like a guest in my own home, like a burden in my own father's life. I had spent years biting my tongue, keeping the peace for my father's sake. But tomorrow, I wouldn't hold back. Morning came faster than I expected, and before I knew it, I was standing outside the courthouse, my heels clicking against the pavement as I made my way inside. I spotted Richard near the entrance, his expression unreadable but reassuring. "Ready?" he asked as I approached. I lifted my chin, always. As we walked into the courtroom, I felt every pair of eyes turned toward us, but I didn't care. I wasn't here to entertain them. I was here to win. And then I saw her. Vanessa sat across the room, dressed in a sleek black dress, her makeup flawless, her hair styled in soft waves, as if she were the grieving widow attending a funeral rather than a court hearing. She even had her 2 adult sons with her, likely hoping their presence would paint her as the loving mother fighting for what was rightfully hers. She turned to look at me, and for a brief second, our eyes met. There it was, the smugness, the quiet confidence of a woman who truly believed she had already won. I smiled. Not because I was happy to see her, but because I knew something she didn't. She had already lost. The judge entered and the room fell silent. My heartbeat was steady, my breathing slow and controlled. Vanessa's lawyer stood first, launching into a dramatic speech about how my father had been too sick, too frail, too easily influenced in his final days. She manipulated him, he declared, gesturing toward me as if I were some kind of villain. She isolated him, made him believe that his own wife was against him. She exploited his weakened state and convinced him to strip my client of what is rightfully hers. I almost laughed. Vanessa, the victim? That was Rich. Richard stood next, his voice calm, unwavering. "Your Honor, we have extensive documentation proving Mr. Carter was of sound mind when he made these changes to his will." He turned and gestured toward the screen set up near the judge's bench. "We also have something else, a video." I heard Vanessa inhale sharply. Richard pressed play. And just like that, the entire room watched as my father appeared on the screen, looking tired but determined, his voice steady as he spoke. "I am making these changes to my will of sound mind and body. My daughter, Deborah, is the rightful heir to my estate. My current wife, Vanessa, has been provided for adequately through our prenuptial agreement, but she will not inherit my business or family home." Silence. For the first time, Vanessa's confident facade cracked, and I knew this was just the beginning. Vanessa thought she had won. She thought she could steal my father's estate and walk away without consequences. But what happened next? It was something she never saw coming. I had proof, ironclad evidence that would shatter her lies completely. What do you think happened in the courtroom? Did she try to fight back, or did she finally break under the pressure? Comment 111 foot if you think she ran, or Wu 22 foot if you think she lost everything right there. The courtroom was so silent I could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall. My father's voice echoed through the speakers, steady and unwavering, despite the illness that had ravaged his body in his final months. His words were clear, precise, leaving no room for interpretation. My daughter, Deborah, is the rightful heir to my estate. My current wife, Vanessa, has been provided for adequately through our prenuptial agreement, but she will not inherit my business or family home. I kept my eyes trained on Vanessa, watching her reaction unfold like a slow-motion train wreck. At first, she sat frozen, her expression unreadable, but then I saw it, the slight twitch in her jaw, the tightening of her grip on the table. Her fingers clenched into fists, her perfectly manicured nails pressing into her palm. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, she looked afraid. Her lawyer shifted in his seat, clearing his throat as if trying to compose himself. "Your Honor," he began, his voice a little less confident than before, "we'd like to call into question the authenticity of this video. Given Mr. Carter's declining health, it is entirely possible that—" "Objection," Richard cut in smoothly, already anticipating this pathetic attempt. "The video is time-stamped, notarized, and witnessed by 2 legal professionals. Furthermore, we have medical records confirming that Mr. Carter was in full control of his mental faculties at the time of this recording." The judge barely spared Vanessa's lawyer a glance before nodding. "Objection sustained. The video remains in evidence." Vanessa's lawyer sat down slowly, and I caught the way she shot him a glare. Her lips pursed so tight they were almost white. I knew what she was thinking. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. In her mind, she had already won. She had pictured this moment differently, me standing here defenseless, scrambling for explanations while she played the grieving widow, sobbing about how cruel and manipulative I had been to a dying man. Instead, the entire courtroom had just watched my father make it painfully clear that she wasn't entitled to a damn thing. I folded my hands neatly in front of me, my expression neutral. Inside, my heart was still pounding, but I wouldn't give her the satisfaction of seeing any reaction from me. Let her stew in her own humiliation. Then, like clockwork, Vanessa did what I had been expecting her to do all along. She leaned forward, her voice trembling in just the right way to sound both vulnerable and outraged. "Your Honor, this is exactly what I was afraid of." She shook her head, feigning devastation. "Deborah has always been resentful of me. She never wanted me in her father's life. I tried to make peace with her, I truly did, but she made it impossible. And now, after everything, she's trying to erase me from my husband's legacy." I almost rolled my eyes. If I hadn't spent the last 5 years watching her perfect this act, I might have believed her myself. Richard, however, wasn't even fazed. He simply flipped open a folder and pulled out a neatly stapled stack of papers. "Your Honor, we anticipated this exact claim. We have here written statements from multiple people in Mr. Carter's life business associates, doctors, family friends, all attesting to the fact that Vanessa systematically isolated him during the last years of his life. We also have phone records showing that she repeatedly intercepted calls meant for his daughter, along with testimony from hospital staff who can confirm that she actively attempted to prevent Miss Carter from visiting her father in his final days. The air in the room shifted. I saw it happen like a tide turning against her. People in the audience began whispering, exchanging glances. Vanessa's carefully crafted image of the devoted, grieving wife was slipping. Her hands clenched in her lap, but she still wasn't ready to give up. "I was only trying to protect him," she protested, her voice rising slightly. "He was sick. He needed rest, not stress from outside influences." Outside influences? I spoke for the first time, my voice cutting through the courtroom like a blade. I turned to face her fully, my posture straight, my expression unreadable. I was his daughter, not some random outside influence. I was the person who had been by his side for 35 years. You were in his life for 5. And in those 5 years, you did everything you could to keep me away from him. Her nostrils flared, her face flushing red. That's not true. Richard didn't even bother acknowledging her outburst. Instead, he pulled out another document and handed it to the judge. This is a sworn affidavit from Mr. Carter's longtime assistant, detailing the numerous instances in which Vanessa attempted to access his financial records without permission. We also have security footage from Mr. Carter's office, showing Vanessa going through his personal files in the middle of the night, mere weeks before his passing. I watched as the judge scanned the documents, his brow furrowing. Then he turned back to Vanessa, his voice firm. Miss S. Carter, do you have any explanation for this? Vanessa's mouth opened, then closed again. For the first time since this hearing began, she had no response. No quick excuse. No well-rehearsed sob story. Just silence. And that silence, it was deafening. I took a slow breath, letting it sink in. I had spent years watching Vanessa play the game, manipulate every situation to her advantage. But this wasn't a game anymore. This was reality. And the reality was, she was losing. She turned to her lawyer, whispering something urgently, but I could already see the panic in her eyes. She was grasping at straws, trying to come up with a new angle, a new way to spin this in her favor. But it was too late. The evidence was overwhelming. Richard leaned in close to me, lowering his voice. She's unraveling. I nodded once, my pulse steady. Let her. Vanessa had walked into this courtroom with the confidence of a woman who thought she had already won. She had believed she could control the narrative, twist the truth, and walk away victorious. But now she was realizing the truth. She was losing, and there was nothing she could do about it. I could feel the tension in the courtroom shift. Vanessa was losing control of the narrative, and she knew it. Her once perfect mask of poise and confidence was cracking right in front of me, and for the first time I saw something flicker in her eyes, real fear. Not the kind of fake, calculated distress she used to manipulate people, but genuine, stomach-dropping panic. She was cornered, and she had nowhere left to run. Her lawyer cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. He was clearly realizing what I had known all along: Vanessa had nothing to stand on. The case she had built was falling apart, piece by piece, and every single attempt to regain control had only made things worse for her. But I wasn't stupid. I knew Vanessa. I knew she wasn't going down without a fight. Sure enough, she straightened in her chair, her fingers gripping the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. Your Honor, she started again, her voice trembling. But this time, it wasn't the trembling of a grieving widow, it was barely concealed rage. This is nothing more than a smear campaign against me. My husband and I shared a life together, and I loved him. He loved me. He wouldn't have just taken everything away without reason. I almost scoffed. She was still playing the victim, still trying to act as if she hadn't spent years draining my father dry, cutting him off from his friends, isolating him from me, and trying to bury her claws so deep into his finances that there wouldn't be anything left by the time he was gone. But my father hadn't been weak. He had seen her for what she was. Richard leaned forward, calmly flipping through another set of documents. Your Honor, if Mrs. Carter is claiming that Mr. Carter's decisions were unexpected or uncharacteristic, I'd like to present further evidence to the contrary. He turned toward the bailiff, who nodded and handed a stack of papers to the judge. Vanessa's eyes darted between them, her breathing uneven now. I could see the panic creeping into her features, like a storm building in the distance. These are financial statements and wire transfer requests initiated by Mrs. Carter in the weeks leading up to Mr. Carter's passing, Richard continued smoothly. As you'll see, she attempted to move nearly $300,000 from my client's business accounts into her personal holdings without his authorization. A collective murmur rippled through the courtroom. Even the judge's expression darkened as he reviewed the papers. Vanessa's lawyer leaned in close to whisper something to her, but she shoved his hand away, eyes flashing. "That money was mine," she snapped. And just like that, she had lost all pretense of civility. Her voice was sharp, venomous, laced with pure, unchecked greed. "Samuel promised me everything. He said I'd never have to worry, that I'd always be taken care of." "Mrs. Carter," the judge cut in, his voice firm, "I suggest you compose yourself." But she couldn't. She was unraveling faster than she could stop herself, and there was nothing left for her to hide behind. I stayed silent, watching her dig herself deeper into a hole she would never climb out of. I didn't need to say a word. She was doing all the damage herself. Her lawyer was frantically whispering to her again, probably telling her to shut up before she made things even worse. But Vanessa wasn't listening. She was too focused on me now, her gaze burning with resentment. "This is your fault," she hissed, so low that only I could hear. "You did this. You turned him against me." I tilted my head slightly, giving her a long, measured look. "No, Vanessa, you did this to yourself." The judge exhaled slowly, setting the papers down. "The evidence presented is highly concerning," he said, his gaze shifting between Vanessa and her now visibly distressed lawyer. "The court will need to take these financial transactions into account when considering the validity of Miss S. Carter's claim." He turned to Richard. "Do you have anything further?" Richard nodded, standing. "Yes, Your Honor. In addition to the financial records, we also have video testimony from Mr. Carter's personal assistant, detailing multiple incidents in which Miss S. Carter attempted to coerce her husband into signing over control of his assets." Vanessa paled. Her breathing quickened, her fingers clutching the edge of the table like she was holding on for dear life. Richard pressed play, and a woman's voice filled the room. Vanessa would wait until Mr. Carter was alone late at night, when he was exhausted from his treatments, and then she'd pressure him. I witnessed her bringing him stacks of paperwork, telling him he needed to take care of things before it was too late. She'd get angry if he refused, accuse him of not trusting her, of not loving her enough. She'd tell him he was being cruel by not securing her future. It was emotional manipulation, plain and simple. The silence that followed was deafening. Vanessa's lawyer was visibly sweating now, gripping his pen like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to reality. Even he knew there was no saving this, no spinning it, no recovering. And Vanessa, for the first time, she had nothing left to say. I could see it in the way her shoulders slumped, in the way her perfectly poised expression finally cracked into something real, something raw. Defeat. She had walked into this courtroom thinking she could control the story, twist it in her favor, make everyone believe she was the one being wronged. But instead, she had exposed herself for exactly what she was: a liar, a manipulator, a thief. The judge let out a long breath, rubbing his temple like he was growing tired of her antics. "Given the overwhelming evidence presented, I am inclined to rule in favor of the estate. However, before making my final decision, I will allow Miss S. Carter one last opportunity to provide a legitimate reason why this claim should not be dismissed." All eyes turned to her. Vanessa's lips parted, like she was about to say something, one last desperate attempt to save herself. But then she hesitated. She looked around the room, at the staring eyes, the judgment, the realization that she had well and truly lost. And then, without another word, she slumped back in her seat and looked away. I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of this moment settle over me. This wasn't just about money. This wasn't just about the house or my father's business. This was justice. And Vanessa? She had finally run out of places to hide. I watched Vanessa slump in her chair, her face pale, her hands gripping the edges of the table, as if she were physically holding on to the last scraps of control she had left. The courtroom was silent, thick with the weight of what had just unfolded. She had been exposed completely, undeniably, and in front of everyone. And yet, even now, I could see her mind racing, desperate to claw her way out of the wreckage of her own making. Richard remained composed beside me, his hands folded neatly in front of him, his expression unreadable. I could feel the energy shifting in the room, the quiet anticipation of the next move. Vanessa wasn't the type to go down quietly, and we all knew it. Her lawyer, visibly shaken, leaned in close to whisper something to her. I saw her flinch, her lips pressing together so tightly they nearly disappeared. Whatever he had said, she didn't like it. Maybe he was advising her to cut her losses, to walk away before she made things worse. But Vanessa was never one to walk away. Instead, she inhaled sharply, straightened her back, and turned toward the judge with a sudden air of indignation, as if she had just now remembered that she was supposed to be the victim. "Your Honor," she said, her voice regaining some of its strength, "none of this changes the fact that I was his wife. I was the one who cared for him when he was sick, who stayed by his side until the very end. I deserve something for that. Surely the court sees that it would be cruel to leave me with nothing." I almost laughed. She was actually trying to guilt-trip the judge. The same woman who had restricted my father's visitors, monitored his phone calls, and tried to pressure him into signing over his estate in his final days was now playing the selfless caretaker? Richard, to his credit, didn't react immediately. He let the weight of her words settle, let her think, for just a moment, that she had regained some ground. And then, in that same calm, controlled voice, he said, "Your Honor, we have one more piece of evidence to submit." Vanessa tensed. Her lawyer turned to him, clearly caught off guard. "Another document?" he asked, though he already knew it was something worse than that. Richard didn't answer. He simply gestured to the bailiff, who nodded and moved toward the television screen positioned in front of the courtroom. My pulse quickened. I had known this was coming. I had sat in Richard's office days before, watching the footage, feeling my stomach twist as I realized just how low Vanessa had gone, but even now, knowing what was about to play, I felt my hands tighten into fists. The video started. It was grainy surveillance footage, captured from the security camera in my father's home office. The room was dimly lit, the timestamp in the corner revealing that it was just after midnight. And there, in the center of the frame, was Vanessa. She was standing in front of my father's desk, her back to the camera, rifling through his drawers with hurried, almost frantic movements. The courtroom was dead silent. Then, the audio kicked in, and suddenly we could hear her. "Where the hell is it?" she muttered under her breath, shuffling through stacks of papers. "He keeps everything in here. There has to be something I can use." There was a rustling sound as she yanked out a file, flipping through pages so quickly they nearly tore. Her breathing was heavy, her voice growing more agitated. "Come on, Samuel, you old bastard. I know you didn't cut me out completely." A sharp inhale rippled through the audience. Even the judge looked stunned. Vanessa, still seated beside her lawyer, went completely rigid. The footage continued. A moment later, she froze in the video, her eyes locked onto something on the desk. Then, with quick, practiced fingers, she pulled out a document, snapped a photo of it with her phone, and shoved it back into place. And then, as if that weren't damning enough, she spoke again, this time, louder. "If you think I'm walking away with nothing, Samuel, you're out of your mind." The video ended. For a full 5 seconds, no one spoke. Then Richard exhaled softly, turned to face the judge, and said, "Your Honor, I think it's safe to say that Mrs. Carter's claim that she was only a devoted wife and caretaker is questionable, at best." Vanessa shot to her feet. "That's not—" "Sit down," her lawyer hissed, grabbing her wrist. But it was too late. Her reaction alone was an admission of guilt. The damage was done. The judge adjusted his glasses, shifting slightly in his seat as he regarded her. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, disappointment, maybe, or disgust. "I've seen enough," he said finally, his voice carrying a finality that sent a shiver down my spine. "Mrs. Carter, do you have anything to say for yourself?" Vanessa stood there, breathing hard, her face a mix of fury and fear. She glanced at her lawyer, at the audience, at me. But there was nothing left to say. She had lost, and she knew it. I took a slow breath, feeling the weight of the past few weeks settle in my chest. This wasn't just about my father's estate anymore. This was about justice. Vanessa had spent years trying to rewrite history, trying to paint herself as the innocent, loving wife while she schemed behind closed doors, manipulating, deceiving, taking. But my father had seen through her, and now, so did everyone else. The judge sighed, rubbing his temple. Given the overwhelming evidence, I will be ruling in favor of the estate as per Mr. Carter's wishes. He turned to Vanessa's lawyer. I suggest your client prepares for further legal proceedings. There are clear indications of financial misconduct here, and I have no doubt the appropriate authorities will be looking into it. Vanessa swayed slightly, like the words had physically hit her. Her whole body seemed to deflate, and just like that, it was over. The gavel struck. The ruling was made. I had won. Vanessa had walked into this courtroom expecting to take everything, but now she was leaving with nothing. As the gavel struck, sealing the judge's ruling, I let out a slow breath. I hadn't even realized I was holding. It was over. The years of manipulation, the endless battles, the suffocating presence of Vanessa in my father's life, everything had finally led to this moment. And she had lost, completely. I turned my gaze toward her, watching as the reality of the situation settled in. Her body was stiff, her lips pressed together in a tight, thin line, but I could see it in her eyes, the sheer panic beneath the carefully constructed facade. She wasn't just angry, she was terrified. Her lawyer was already gathering his papers, avoiding eye contact, clearly wanting to get out of there as fast as possible. He knew there was nothing left to argue, no last-minute Hail Mary that could change the fact that his client had just been humiliated in front of an entire courtroom. Vanessa, however, wasn't ready to accept that. Not yet. She turned to me, her face pale but her expression venomous. "You think this is over?" she hissed, her voice barely above a whisper, but sharp enough to cut through the noise of people standing, papers shuffling, the murmurs of the audience who had just witnessed her downfall. "You think you've won?" I tilted my head slightly, taking in the sight of her, this woman who had spent years trying to destroy my relationship with my father, who had tried to erase me from his life, who had expected to walk away from this with everything he built. And now? She had nothing. "I don't think," I said calmly, adjusting my bag over my shoulder. "I know." Her breath hitched. For a brief second, I saw something flicker across her face, regret, maybe, or the crushing realization that she had played her final card and lost. But then, just like that, the mask slipped back into place. She straightened her back, lifted her chin, and turned sharply on her heel, walking out of the courtroom with her lawyer trailing behind her. She didn't look back, not once. I should have felt triumphant. I should have felt relieved. But as I stood there, watching her disappear through the heavy wooden doors, I realized that all I felt was empty. This wasn't about winning. This had never been about revenge or proving a point. This was about honoring my father's final wishes. And now that it was done, I just felt tired. Richard placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder, his voice steady. "You did it, Deborah. Your father would be proud." I nodded, but the lump in my throat made it impossible to respond. I left the courthouse that afternoon feeling lighter, but also heavier in ways I couldn't explain. There was no celebration, no rush of euphoria, just the quiet understanding that I had done what needed to be done. But Vanessa, she wasn't done yet. 2 days later, I got a call from Richard. "She's refusing to leave the house." I closed my eyes, inhaling sharply. Of course, she was. "She claims she needs time to gather her belongings," he continued, his voice laced with barely concealed irritation. "But I think we both know that's just an excuse. She wasn't just gathering her things. She was stalling, hoping for some last-minute miracle, some loophole that would let her slither her way back in." "What are my options?" I asked, gripping the edge of my kitchen counter. Richard sighed. Legally, she has no right to be there. The house is in your name, the court ruling was final. If she doesn't leave voluntarily, we can file an official eviction notice. I exhaled, rubbing my temples. I had given Vanessa too much credit. I thought, after everything, she would at least have the dignity to walk away with whatever scraps of pride she had left. But no, she was still clinging to the fantasy that somehow she could still win. I wasn't about to let that happen. I want her out, I said firmly, whatever it takes. Richard didn't argue. I'll handle it. The next day, I drove up to the house. My house. It had been years since it had truly felt like home. Not since my father married Vanessa. Not since she started stripping it of every memory of my mother. Every piece of the life we had before she came along. I stepped out of the car and stared up at the massive front door, my chest tightening. This place had once been filled with warmth, laughter, the sound of my father's voice echoing through the halls as he made deals over the phone or called me in to show me some new business plan he was working on. Now, it felt like a mausoleum. Taking a deep breath, I knocked. For a moment, silence. Then, slow footsteps. A pause. And finally, the door swung open. Vanessa stood there, still dressed in the expensive clothes my father had bought her, still wearing that same smug expression as if she still had some kind of upper hand. I didn't give her the satisfaction of reacting. "You have 48 hours to be out of this house," I said, my voice steady. "After that, we will involve the authorities." Her lips curled into a smirk. "You think I'm afraid of you?" I met her gaze, unblinking. "No," I said simply. "I think you're afraid of being nothing." The words hit her harder than I expected. Her smirk faltered, her fingers tightening around the edge of the doorframe. Because it was true. Without my father, without his money, without this house, Vanessa was nothing. For the first time in years, I saw it. The fear, the realization that she had gambled everything and lost. She swallowed hard, but she didn't argue. Because she knew. She had no fight left. I turned, stepping off the porch, feeling the weight of it all pressing down on me. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I had already won. 2 days later, she was gone. And for the first time in a long time, the house felt mine again. I stood in the doorway of my father's house, my house now, and let the silence settle around me. For the first time in years, there was no tension in the air, no looming presence of Vanessa lurking in the corners, no suffocating feeling of being unwelcome in a place that had once been my home. The walls still carried the echoes of the past, of my father's voice, of my childhood laughter, of late nights spent reviewing business plans together at the dining room table. But something else lingered, too, the ghost of Vanessa's influence. Even though she was gone, the damage she had done was still woven into the very fabric of this house. I took a slow breath, stepping inside. The floors creaked beneath me as I made my way through the foyer, past the grand staircase. Vanessa had insisted on remodeling to make more modern, as if stripping away my mother's taste could erase the life that had been built here before her. The furniture, the paintings, the expensive rugs, all of it was hers. My father never cared for extravagance. He had been a man of substance, not surface. But Vanessa, she had made sure to wrap herself in wealth like armor. And now, all that was left of her was the emptiness she had tried to fill with material things. I walked through the house with measured steps, taking in every detail, letting the memories resurface. In the living room, I could still see my father sitting in his favorite armchair, sipping his morning coffee as he read through financial reports. In the kitchen, I could hear his voice teasing me about my terrible attempts at making pancakes when I was a kid. It was all still here, hidden beneath the expensive facade Vanessa had forced upon this place. Then I reached his office. My chest tightened as I stepped inside, the familiar scent of old leather and polished wood hitting me all at once. My father had spent countless hours here, building the empire that Vanessa had so desperately tried to steal. His desk was still there, untouched, just as he had left it before he got too sick to use it. I ran my fingers along the surface, feeling the weight of everything that had led to this moment. This desk had held the contracts that secured my father's legacy, the documents that ensured Vanessa couldn't take what wasn't hers. This was where he had outmaneuvered her, where he had set everything in place to protect me, even after he was gone. I swallowed hard, blinking back the sting of tears. Then something caught my eye. A small, almost imperceptible gap between the drawers, a space I hadn't noticed before. Frowning, one reached down and tugged at the panel. It shifted under my fingers, and with a soft click, a hidden compartment slid open. Inside was a journal. My breath caught in my throat as I pulled it out, the worn leather cover cool against my palms. I recognized my father's handwriting, immediately bold, precise, the handwriting of a man who always had a plan. I sank into his chair, my fingers trembling slightly as I flipped open the first page. And then I started to read. Vanessa thinks I don't see what she's doing, but I do. I've always seen it. The late-night phone calls, the bank statements that don't add up, the way she watches me when she thinks I'm not looking. She's waiting, planning, hoping. I'll be too weak to fight back, but she underestimates me, and she underestimates my daughter. A chill ran down my spine. I turned the pages, scanning entry after entry, each one a record of Vanessa's manipulations. My father had documented everything. The way she had pushed him to rewrite his will in her favor, the arguments she had staged to make. It seemed like I was the one trying to take advantage of him. The way she had coerced his doctors into limiting my visits. She doesn't love me. I know that now. Maybe I've always known. She loves what I can give her, but I won't let her take what I built. Not from me, and not from Deborah. My vision blurred for a moment, my father's words sinking deep into my bones. He had fought for me until the very end. Even when he was sick, even when he was weak, he had never stopped protecting me. I closed the journal, pressing it against my chest as a wave of emotions crashed over me. Anger, sadness, gratitude. Then my phone rang. I inhaled sharply, setting the journal down and pulling my phone from my pocket. Richard's name flashed across the screen. I answered. "Tell me it's good news." There was a beat of silence. Then, "It's about Vanessa." My stomach dropped. What about her? "She's being investigated for fraud." The words hung between us, heavy and electric. I sat up straighter, gripping the phone tighter. "What?" Richard let out a slow breath. "The financial records we submitted in court weren't the only ones reviewed. It turns out Vanessa has a history of this. Targeting wealthy men, draining their assets, moving on to the next. Your father wasn't the first, but he was the first to stop her." A slow, cold realization settled over me. My father had suspected something like this. That's why he had been so careful. "What happens now?" I asked. "Well," Richard said, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction, depending on what they find. "She could be facing serious charges. Bank fraud, financial exploitation, and if they dig deep enough, it's possible she's been committing crimes across multiple states." I exhaled sharply, running a hand through my hair. So this wasn't just about my father anymore. Vanessa had spent years perfecting her con, moving from one victim to the next, always staying one step ahead. But now, she had finally been caught. I leaned back in my father's chair, staring up at the ceiling, letting the weight of it all settle over me. She had spent so much time trying to destroy me, trying to steal from my father, trying to rewrite history in her favor. And now, she was the one being erased. I glanced back down at the journal on the desk, running my fingers over the cover. My father had known. He had seen her for what she was. He had fought back the only way he could, with meticulous planning, with unwavering determination, with love. And in the end, he had won. And so had I. I sat in my father's office long after the call with Richard ended, my mind spinning with everything I had just learned. Vanessa wasn't just a manipulative gold digger. She was a career con artist, A woman who had spent years, maybe even decades, perfecting the art of deception, sinking her claws into wealthy men, bleeding them dry, and then moving on before anyone could catch her. But this time, she had stayed too long, she had underestimated my father, and now, finally, she was trapped. I traced my fingers over the worn leather cover of his journal, still lying open on his desk. My father had known. He had seen her for what she was, long before she realized he was onto her. And the more I read, the more I understood just how much he had done to protect me. He had been 3 steps ahead of Vanessa at every turn, setting up his estate, locking down his finances, making sure that when the time came, she wouldn't be able to take anything. And now, the consequences of her greed were finally catching up to her. I closed my eyes for a moment, exhaling slowly. Then, with a newfound sense of clarity, I stood, tucking the journal under my arm. There was one last thing I needed to do before I could truly put this all behind me. I needed to see her fall. 2 days later, I found myself back at the courthouse. This time, I wasn't the one on trial. Vanessa had been officially charged with financial fraud. The evidence Richard had uncovered, her unauthorized wire transfers, her attempts to falsify financial documents, and now, thanks to the investigation, a trail of similar crimes in multiple states was irrefutable. She wasn't just losing my father's estate. She was losing everything. The courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back row, whispering among themselves, cameras clicking as Vanessa was let in, her wrists cuffed together. I had seen her wear a lot of different expressions over the years: fake sorrow, manufactured concern, calculated manipulation, but today, for the first time, she looked truly, completely defeated. Her once perfectly styled hair was unkempt, her designer clothes replaced with a plain, beige jumpsuit. She still carried herself with the remnants of the arrogance that had defined her for so long, but I could see the cracks. The barely concealed panic in her eyes, the way she kept glancing toward the exit like she was searching for an escape. But there was no escape. Not anymore. She was trapped in the very web she had spun for others. I sat near the front, my hands folded in my lap, my expression unreadable. I wanted her to see me. I wanted her to know that I was here, that I had won. And then, as if she could feel my gaze, her eyes met mine. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. She hated me. I could see it written all over her face. But beneath the hatred, there was something else. Something raw. Fear. The judge entered, and the courtroom fell silent. The proceedings began, but I barely listened. I already knew how this was going to end. Her lawyer tried to argue for leniency, claiming that she had been in emotional distress following my father's death, that she had made some questionable financial decisions, but wasn't a criminal. But the evidence said otherwise. The prosecution laid it all out: every fraudulent transaction, every attempt to siphon money from my father's accounts, every manipulation, every lie. And then the final nail in her coffin. One of her previous victims had come forward. A man in his 60s, well-dressed, with a haunted look in his eyes. He took the stand and, in a steady voice, told the court how Vanessa had done the exact same thing to him. How she had infiltrated his life, convinced him to marry her, drained his accounts, and then disappeared the moment he got sick. I could feel the energy in the room shift. Vanessa didn't just steal. She preyed on people. She waited until they were vulnerable, until they trusted her completely, and then she took everything. And now, she was paying for it. The judge leaned forward, his expression severe. Given the overwhelming evidence presented, I find the defendant guilty of financial fraud, embezzlement, and identity theft. She will be remanded into custody until sentencing. A stunned silence followed. Then, a single gasp. Vanessa. She collapsed into her seat, her face paling, her chest rising and falling in short, panicked breaths. She had expected to walk away with a slap on the wrist, a fine maybe, a brief probation. But this was real. I watched her, waiting for her to look at me again. And when she finally did, I leaned forward slightly, my voice barely above a whisper. You did this to yourself. She opened her mouth, maybe to argue, maybe to beg, but nothing came out. For the first time since she entered our lives, she had nothing left to say. The bailiffs moved in, ready to escort her out. As she was led past me, she turned one last time. Her expression, a mixture of fury and desperation. I met her gaze, completely unshaken. And then she was gone. I let out a slow breath, my entire body finally relaxing. It was over. Truly, finally over. I stepped outside, the crisp air filling my lungs, the weight of the past few years lifting off my shoulders. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel hate. I just felt free. My father had won. His legacy was intact. His business was in good hands. His estate was protected. And Vanessa? She would never steal from another man again. I took one last look at the courthouse before turning away. For the first time in years, I was ready to move forward. And this time, there was nothing, and no one left to stand in my way. I stood outside the courthouse, watching the last traces of Vanessa disappear as she was led into the transport van, her wrists shackled, her fate sealed. The moment should have felt triumphant, victorious, and in some ways it did, but mostly it just felt like the end of a long, exhausting battle, a battle I never wanted to fight in the first place. The sky overhead was a pale shade of blue, the kind that always reminded me of early mornings with my father, sitting on the back porch, drinking coffee, going over market trends and investment strategies. He had always said the key to success wasn't just in knowing how to win, it was in knowing how to protect what you had built. And now, standing here with my father's estate intact, his legacy untarnished, I finally understood what he meant. I had spent so much time fighting to keep what was rightfully mine, to ensure that the woman who tried to destroy everything he built never got her hands on it. And now, for the first time since this nightmare began, I could finally do what I had been too distracted to do before. I could finally grieve. The weight of that realization settled deep in my chest as I walked toward my car, my footsteps feeling heavier than they had that morning. It wasn't just about Vanessa anymore. It never really had been. This was about losing my father. About coming to terms with the fact that no matter how much I fought, how much I won, he was still gone. I got into the driver's seat, my hands gripping the steering wheel, but I didn't start the car right away. Instead, I sat there, staring ahead, letting the emotions crash over me all at once. I thought about the last conversation I ever had with him, the way he had looked at me tired but determined, his fingers wrapped around mine as he said, "You're stronger than you think, Deborah. You always have been." I had spent so much time proving him right. Now, I just wished he was still here to see it. A soft knock on my window pulled me from my thoughts. I blinked, turning to see Richard standing outside, his expression unreadable but gentle. I rolled the window down. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded once. "Yeah, I think I am." He hesitated, then gave me a small smile. "Your father would be proud." The lump in my throat grew tighter, but I forced a smile in return. "I hope so." Richard glanced back at the courthouse, then back at me. "Vanessa won't be getting out of this one," he said. "With everything they've uncovered, she'll be behind bars for a long time." I nodded, exhaling slowly. Good. And I meant it. Not out of spite, not because I wanted revenge, but because it was right. She had spent her life stealing, lying, destroying people. And now she was done. Richard gave my car door a light tap. "Go home, Deborah, get some rest." Home. The word felt different now. Lighter. I drove back to the house that night, my house now. Truly mine, and as I pulled into the driveway, I realized it was the first time in years I wasn't dreading walking through the front door. I stepped inside, the quiet settling around me like a familiar embrace. There was no Vanessa, no lingering presence of her twisted control, just me and my father's memory. I wandered through the room slowly, my fingers brushing against old furniture, childhood photographs, remnants of a life before she had come into it. I had spent so much time fighting to reclaim this house, but now that it was mine again, I realized how much of it still belonged to him. And then I knew what I had to do. The next morning, I started taking back what Vanessa had tried to erase. I went through every room, removing every trace of her. The gaudy furniture she had picked out, the ridiculous modern art she had insisted on hanging, the expensive but soulless decor that had never belonged in this house to begin with, it all went. I hired a crew to restore everything back to the way it was before she came in and twisted it into something unrecognizable. I even found some of my mother's old belongings, tucked away in storage boxes Vanessa had tried to get rid of. Her paintings, her books, the little trinkets she had collected over the years. I placed them back where they belonged, where they should have always been. Slowly, room by room, I made the house feel like home again. But it wasn't just about the house. I went back to my father's business, stepping into the office that had once felt like a second home to me. The employees, many of whom had worked with my father for decades, welcomed me back like I had never left. Some of them even told me stories I had never heard before, little details about my father's generosity, his leadership, the way he had always spoken about me with pride. And as I sat at his old desk, running my fingers over the wood that had once been his, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just about protecting what was his. It was about continuing what he built. And so I did. I threw myself into the business, not just running it, but growing it, expanding into new markets, bringing in fresh talent, launching initiatives my father had once dreamed of, but never had the chance to see through. I even started a scholarship program in his name, offering financial aid to young professionals looking to break into the real estate industry. It felt like coming full circle. One afternoon, as I was clearing out my father's study, I found an old photo album tucked away in the bottom drawer of his desk. Inside, there were pictures of us standing in front of his very first real estate project, celebrating my college graduation, laughing over drinks at one of our favorite spots. And then, at the very back, a letter. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded it. "Deborah," it began, "if you're reading this, then everything has gone according to plan. I knew Vanessa would try to take what wasn't hers, and I knew you would stop her. But this was never just about winning. It was about ensuring that everything we built together would live on, in the hands of the person I trust most. My daughter, my legacy, my greatest success." I pressed my lips together, tears slipping down my cheeks. He had always believed in me, even when I had doubted myself, even when I had felt like the fight was too much, too exhausting, too impossible. He had known I would make it through. I closed my eyes, clutching the letter to my chest, and for the first time since he passed, I felt at peace. Not because I had won, not because Vanessa had lost, but because I had done right by him, because I had honored his legacy, and because, finally, I was ready to move forward. In the end, justice was served. Vanessa lost everything: her money, her power, even her freedom. But this wasn't just about revenge. It was about standing up for what's right, about making sure manipulators like her don't win. My father's legacy remained intact because he planned ahead, and I fought to protect what was his. So tell me, have you ever had to stand your ground against someone trying to take what's yours? Share your story in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you believe in fighting for what's right. In the end, this wasn't just about winning a legal battle. It was about standing up for what's right. Too often, people like Vanessa manipulate, steal, and destroy without consequences. But my father taught me that planning ahead, knowing your rights, and refusing to be intimidated are the best ways to protect yourself. Whether it's your family, your finances, or your future, be prepared. Don't wait until someone tries to take what's yours. Secure it, defend it. Because in this world, justice isn't just given, it's fought for.